You're listening to WeAreSTS, a podcast from the Department of Science and Technology Studies at University College London. Hi, everybody, and welcome back to WeAreSTS. I'm your host, Professor Joe Cain. This is episode 5. Welcome back, everybody. Now, we're recording this episode as April 1st approaches. The academic term has just ended. Far more important, April Fool's Day is around the corner. We thought we'd tell a bunch of jokes, but that surely was going to end badly. So, we decided on a different idea. Today, I'm turning the microphone over to Dr. Rebecca Martin. Becky is one of our most recent PhD students. She's an expert in the history of science and medicine in the last 2 centuries, and she's an expert in how racial stereotypes shaped medical education. In this episode, Becky's going to interview me about a research paper I wrote about the life and afterlife of one joke in biology. She's going to ask me about the story I tell, and then she'll ask me the incredibly difficult question of why is this story important? And here I thought she'd go easy on me. No chance. The research paper we're talking about is called In My Tribe: What the Snouters and Other Jokes Reveal About Tribes in Science. Now, absolutely unbiased, this is a great paper, and it's one of those ones you're gonna want to read. It's fantastic. Of course, I wrote it, so I would say that. A link to the paper is in the show notes. For our interview, we're speaking over a telephone line. We start with Becky asking me simply to introduce myself.
Can you tell us a little bit about yourself, Joe?
Sure thing, Becky. I'm professor in history and philosophy of biology at University College London. I'm in the Department of Science and Technology Studies, or as we call it, STS. My real interest is in the really arcane subject of the history of evolutionary studies across the 19th and 20th century. Where that translates into something interesting is really, it's the history of Darwinism, so what people did with Darwin's ideas, and then also the history of dinosaurs, or the history of paleontology. I'm a huge fan of places like the Dinosaurs in Crystal Palace, or any museum where dinosaurs and prehistoric relics are on display. I think it's an absolutely fascinating problem to look at the bits and pieces that we've found from the past and to construct these fantastic stories. So those are the kinds of things I'm interested in.
So this is a fantastic paper. Maybe you could tell us a little bit, what is a snouter and what is this paper about?
Right. Well, my paper is about snouters and snouterology, the study of snouters, you might say. What's a snouter? Well, a snouter is a mammal, a really small mammal about the size of a mouse or a shrew. The story of the snouters begins really in 1961 when an encyclopedia about snouters is published in the form of a small academic monograph. And by all accounts, it just looks exactly like all the other zoological monographs that get published in the 1950s and 60s. It's very technical. It's got a lot of illustrations. It's got real rich detail. And basically, it lays out this notion that on an archipelago in the South Pacific, where few people had ever visited, there is this strange fauna of these little mammals. Get this, the thing that makes the snouters so interesting is that they're mammals that they walk on their nose. Yeah, they walk on their nose. That's the weirdest thing. And the diversity of these snouters is tremendous. So you've got little snouters and big snouters. You've got herbivore snouters and you have carnivore snouters. You have snouters with long noses and short noses. And you have snouters with one nose. And then you have snouters with many noses. And this means of locomotion makes the group distinct. And it's something that no one had seen before. And when this little encyclopedic monograph came out in the early 1960s, it just was one of the weirdest things. You get it and you scratch your head and you think, we know life is weird. Every place we look, we find something that's weirder than where we looked previously. And the Snouters comes out and just pushes this right to the very edge. Well, the thing I'm interested in about the Snouters is it's a joke. It's a joke in the form of a scientific monograph published as a prank, published as kind of an inside joke. And it looks real. It looks formal. It looks technical. It's done in all the right ways, and it's produced in the context of it. You know, if you don't know what you're talking about, you could think that it's real. So the story of the Snouters really is two levels. I mean, one is what are these animals and what are they doing and what do they look like and that kind of stuff. But then there's another level, which is this is a joke. Who did it? Why? Where? What was their intent? And then what happened once the joke got out into the wild? Did people like it? Did they hate it? Did they tell it again? Did they change it and whatnot? And my snouterology is not really the study of the fictional mammals. My snouterology is the study of the story and how it goes from the joke teller to the next, to the next, to the next, to the next. And it turns out it's just an absolutely fascinating story, rich with things that people in STS, in science and technology studies, can explore. And it tells us a lot about the scientific community.
It seems like this story has such a long life. Could you tell us a little bit more about how it develops over time and what sort of ways people kind of come into this and or don't come into it, as you said?
Sure thing. Well, the story of the Snouters' afterlife is really what this paper explores. I mean, I do in the paper, I talk about the author of the Snouter joke. I talk about where he came from and what was his intent and the backstory to the Snouters book originally. Far more important to me is the afterlife of the joke. So once it's told and published and out in the wild, what happens next? And you can follow the story from the author's perspective because the Snouters' story gets republished in different languages. It's originally published in German. There's a French version fairly quickly. There's an English language version. There's a Japanese version. There's an Italian version. And so each time the Snouter story gets republished, there are bits and pieces added on, not necessarily to the joke, but to the interpretation of the joke. My paper follows that story in some detail. And it also follows the way other people have picked up the joke and ran with it. You don't have to look far on the internet to find lots of examples of Snouters being recycled or reused. So, for example, sculptors seem to really love to create Snouter sculptures, and artists seem to really like to come up with new ideas for Snouters and how they go about their locomotion. And every once in a while, somebody comes up with the idea of having discovered a new Snouter or a new Snouter artifact. And this joke gets not just recycled, but it gets added to. So in my paper, I kind of put on the anthropologist hat and I ask the question, what's going on here? What are people really doing? Partly I want to tell the factual story. What have people done? But I also want to say, well, why are they doing this? What's in a joke? What's in the telling of a joke? And what's in the telling of this particular kind of joke? So those are the kinds of things I want to get at in my paper. At one level, the factual story, the who, where, what, and why, and then also the analysis, the what does this mean here? What can we learn about science by investigating a story of a joke?
Yeah, so you were saying, obviously, this was published under a pseudonym. So obviously this was Harold Stumpke, the pseudonym, but it was actually somebody called Gerolf Steiner. And why do you think that Steiner published this under a pseudonym? What does that tell us about his aims for the work or anything along those lines?
Yeah, so the original Snouters volume is published under the authorship of somebody named Harold Stumpke. And Stumpke is just the pseudonym for this guy, Gerolf Steiner. And Steiner has a really interesting story to tell. Part of his interesting story is that he publishes under lots of pseudonyms. I mean, I've found 4 pseudonyms that he's published in, and I am sure that there are others that we haven't made a connection to yet. Why is he doing this? Well, frankly, I don't know. But I think what he's doing is it's about credibility and voice. I mean, a lot of people these days have 2 or 3 Twitter accounts or 2 or 3 Facebook accounts. Maybe they have a personal account and they have a professional account, and they have very different voices in those 2 different accounts. I think what Gerolf Steiner did was he used the pseudonyms to communicate different things that formed the whole of his personality. I mean, so for example, he published a political book, and when he published a political book, it was under a different name. When he wanted to write up his story about the Snouters, I guess he felt he couldn't come out and say, I did it. And so he creates a fictional personality that comes and interviews him so that his life story is not an autobiography. It's written on as a journalistic account of somebody who's come and interviewed him. But Steiner used pseudonyms in a bunch of different contexts. And again, I think it's about voice, and I think it's about his own sense of credibility. And I suppose he didn't want to cross the streams, as some people say.
Yeah, so it's like he's trying to have 4 careers as 4 different kind of professionals under his various different pseudonyms, which is, it's hard enough having one, let alone 4.
It is indeed hard enough having one career, let alone 4. But I guess in a world where reputational capital is built up in certain ways, I think it might say something about how Gerald Steiner, the original human being, how he felt he sat in the community around him. It's one of those examples where we might need a professional sociologist in the room to help us interpret what it meant for reputation to publish in these different kinds of settings for a university academic in Germany in the early 1960s.
One thing that you really talk about in the article is this idea of joke law, which sounds really fascinating. What is joke law?
Joke lore is a bit of sociology or anthropology. So joke lore is the study of jokes. And it's not studying jokes like a comedian might study jokes, what makes a joke funny, that sort of thing. It's not that at all. What it is it's watching the social work that takes place around jokes and joking. So, for example, we might joke amongst ourselves and we might have those inside jokes. Well, a sociologist or anthropologist might ask the question, who gets told that joke and who doesn't get told that joke? Joke lore is the idea of watching how jokes circulate and then making some interpretations about society as a consequence of the flow of those jokes, about how those jokes travel. So we might joke with people we call our friends, and we might joke about people we don't call our friends. Think about the first time you heard an inside joke. You may not have noticed that you were being brought into a certain community, or I say tribe, into a certain tribe. And think about when you're joking with your friends about other people, perhaps sometimes even cruelly, what is the social function of telling those jokes? So joke lore is it's a growing area of academic research where people are looking, for example, at the way comedy programs on television bring together certain audiences and push away other audiences, or how comedy can be used as a tool for gluing together communities that previously didn't think they had much in common. Joke lore is the study of the function of jokes in society one way or another. So, Becky, you were telling me before we started recording about a joke that you know in a particular community. Do you want to tell that story?
We have a very similar thing in the world of fencing. So I compete in fencing as a sport. There are 3 weapons in fencing, 2 of which require wires and 1 does not. And quite a common question when people are running to become the new, it's called the armourer, but essentially the repair manager of the club, is how do you rewire a sabre? And the joke being that the sabre doesn't have a wire, so it doesn't need doing. It's usually asked because it's so ridiculous that anybody that's been doing fencing for more than a couple of months would know that. And so the idea being is that it's never going to cause an awkward situation in close-knit contexts. Although obviously if you ask it in a situation where there are other people who aren't fencers, it does look a little bit strange. Yeah, it's something that definitely I relate to on a social level as something that bonds a group, but could also be quite exclusionary if it's not pitched in exactly the right manner.
Well, even history of science, as arcane as it is, has its own inside jokes that come out as a soft test of tribalism, I suppose is the way to say it. There's a simple example, is a character named Bucculentus, who was a character living in Europe during the early modern period, so roughly 1450 to 1700. And I have certainly seen at conferences where somebody stands up and gives a paper about that period or about something in that period, a hand goes up and someone asks, well, did Bucculentus get involved in this, or did Bucculentus know anything about it? And Bucculentus being an entirely fictional person, you sometimes see elbows going into sides somewhere in the audience where people say, watch this, see what happens. And it's meant as a very gentle test for the speaker. Sometimes I have seen people try to blag their way through an answer. And that's an example where the joke, I suppose, has been deployed as a way to test the boundaries of knowledge. Other times when that question gets asked, people just giggle and go, yeah, thanks very much. And they move on. And I suppose the social act being done there it's a bit of an initiation. It's a bit of welcoming people into a club. To take your case, I mean, imagine if a person was asked that in an interview and they answered it wrongly. Do you think that they'd be invited to be an armorer? I just don't think so.
You talked a little bit earlier about how jokes are kind of a social binder and creator of social networks. But are jokes any more serious than that in our study in STS? Do they do any more serious work?
Jokes perform social work, but they also perform intellectual work too. I mean, think about what satire does and how sometimes satire can be absolutely scathing about some things. I mean, we know in History of Ideas that there are some ideas that have just been ruthlessly satirized, and that was the end of the idea. And so in this paper, I look at Gerolsteiner's work and I look at the Snouters and the telling of the story of the Snouters, and I try to understand what social work is happening here, who's in the tribe and who's out of the tribe as this joke flows around the community. And then also I try to look at the intellectual work that the joke does. So maybe Steiner's trying to get away with a certain kind of defense of a particular theory in zoology that probably for most of us is pretty arcane and we wouldn't understand it. I certainly know that as the joke is retold, as different editions of Steiner's work comes out, you see in the way people frame the joke. So they write an introduction, say. And in one edition of the Snouters, the introduction says, "This work is an excellent defense of Darwinism." And then in another version of the work, the introduction says, "This joke attacks Darwinism and it proves Darwinism wrong." So you can see how the intellectual work is being deployed there one way or another. And that's just within science. If you look at broader communities, like for example, you just go on the internet and you watch and you see how the Snouters float around the internet, you can see them put to work in various ways. So for example, sometimes biologists use the Snouters, they invoke the Snouters and they say, the great thing about the Snouters is biology is just so weird. And here's an example. There's weirder stuff for real in life than the Snouters. So if you got the Snouters, come on and, for example, go to marine biology, and Snouters are nothing compared to what you see in the open ocean. And conversely, creationists sometimes invoke Snouters as an example of a scientific fraud. And then they say, well, everything about evolution is a fraud, they say. And here's a great example. These scientists are just lying all the time. So you watch how the Snouters flows around cultures and it's put to work. The Snouters certainly is no way near the only example where this takes place. And this is how the Snouters case builds onto a much more complex area of joke lore and other parts of science and technology studies.
Okay, so thinking about this in a little bit more of a serious context now, how is studying comedy and looking at humor in this way a part of what we do in STS?
Well, scientists are people. And people make jokes, and we can study the way they joke, just like a sociologist or an anthropologist can study any group and how they joke as a way to understand how they form small communities, how they form large communities, how they include people and how they exclude people. And that's just one example of what we do in science and technology studies. I'm formally trained as a historian and as a philosopher, so I can talk a lot about the history of ideas, but I'm also intensely interested in the history of scientific communities, what holds them together, what separates them. When a small discipline wants to form and go in another direction, I mean, what happens? How do they make that happen? And also we want to look at ways to increase inclusiveness and understand the barriers to inclusion within scientific communities. Those are really important topics right about now. And it sounds funny, but we can be really serious when we study jokes, and we can use jokes for very serious things. And one of the things I really love about STS is that it's so flexible. I mean, we can take a fairly straightforward idea, like a simple sentence, like people tell jokes, and then we can expand that into a hugely meaningful activity of understanding who sticks together and who doesn't. And also from the intellectual historian's point of view, my own background, I absolutely love to see how people criticize views that they disagree with and how they create jokes to support the kinds of ideas that they really embrace. A lot of great examples that I mentioned a few in in the paper on the Snouters and Snouterology. And a great example is where people would write kind of formal book reviews, writing about the Snouters monograph. And it's entirely tongue in cheek. They are very sure that they've got the joke, and they're writing a book review as a way to sit back and go, hey, well done, thumbs up. Another thing I absolutely love to see is where professionals in the field, serious professionals, they don't seem to get the joke, or somehow the joke has fallen flat for them. And every once in a while, you'll see in the formal, technical, real zoological literature, you'll see references made to the Snouters. And most of the time, it's pretty clear they're kind of joking, that they've added it maybe just to kind of show off, to show that they know that that this is a joke. But then I certainly have found a few examples where I'm pretty sure they didn't get it. And I'm pretty sure other people think the same thing. And then just to watch what happens there, that little ripple across the water, just to watch what happens. And I've certainly heard people say to me, here, look at this example. This person, they didn't get the joke. They didn't even know that this was impossible. And you think, wow, that's interesting. What's going on there?
So is this paper just an April Fool's gift for us in the department, or is this part of a larger project moving forwards? What will we see next from you?
Well, what's next for me? I guess I'm going to move from comedy to tragedy, I'm afraid. I've moved on from talking about joke lore and jokes in science to study the history and legacies of eugenics, particularly at my own university at UCL. And I'm interested in the history of eugenics at UCL because in some ways it hasn't been talked about nearly as much as it should be. But I'm also interested in an idea of what I'm coming to call institutional entrepreneurship. It's certainly the case that there were people who advocated eugenics at UCL in the early part of the 20th century. And what I want to know is not so much what did they say, because it's pretty clear what they said, but how did they get away with what they wanted to do? How did they get themselves placed in a university? Because inside the university, exactly at the same time, there were people who thought that this was a terrible idea, that we shouldn't even get close to this, that it has no academic respectability and it needs to not be here. So that ultimately the question is, in that opposition, how did they manage to succeed? How did they manage to stay? How did they manage to move ahead? And that's where this idea of institutional entrepreneurship comes in. So I really want to know, how did they move within the institution to get the approvals that they did, to get the facilities that they did? What kinds of rewards did they stand up and say, this shows that I'm doing a good job? And what is senior management thinking about all this stuff? Because somebody had to say yes, and somebody had to say, keep going, it's okay. And I want to know why. Were they sympathetic to eugenics? Or the answer could be much more revealing. And it could be that eugenics at the very beginning of the 20th century, it looked good from the point of view of an institution that wanted to promote cutting-edge research, risky research that connects to policy, research that seems to be heading in a direction that's brand new. I mean, we could take the word eugenics out and put in something like research into artificial intelligence, and it wouldn't sound so different today. One of the things I want to do is test a hypothesis, which is eugenics is moving forward at the university, not because there's a foaming at the mouth racism that is trying to be embedded institutionally, but because there are few people who know how to talk the talk and know how to walk the walk, and they speak in a way that the institution wants to hear, and the executives, they may be sympathetic with eugenics, but what really gets their approval is that they think it solves lots of problems for the university at that particular time. And it delivers for the university some of the things that people want at the time. So where am I going next in research? I'm moving from comedy to tragedy. I'm looking at the history and legacies of eugenics at UCL, and that's what I've been working on for about a year now, and probably for another year or two. I'll be working in this particular area, working with my colleague, Dr. Maria Kaladi, who's really fantastic. And there'll be more on the podcast about the history and legacies of eugenics at UCL, more to come. But that's the thing that I'm moving into.
Thank you so much for talking to me today, Joe, about your fantastic piece. I think this is a great paper for April Fool's Day, and I think everybody should make sure they go and have a look at In My Tribe, What the Snouters and Other Jokes Reveal About Tribes and Science by Joe Cain.
Thanks, Becky. Thanks very much. Hey, thanks for doing the interview, and long live the Snouters and long live Snouterology. We'll see you again soon. Bye now. Well, that's our episode for today. We hope you heard something new. I should have told you about the horse Equus pantomimus, or some of the other jokes in zoology. I'll put a link in the show notes if you want to find out more. Thanks to Becky, that's Dr. Rebecca Martin, for doing the interview and for not being too rough on me. We'll have her back in a future episode to talk about her own research on racialization in the history of medical education. Music today was Rollin' at 5 by Kevin MacLeod. It's available on the website filmmusic.io. WeAreSTS is a production of the Department of Science and Technology Studies at University College London. If you're thinking about studying sociology of science with us, or any of the other subjects we do, just get in touch. We have lots of options. We'll have another episode soon. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss out. And finally, you can find out more about the show, tell us what you think, and explore more of the courses we offer just by visiting our website. Here's the address, so write it down. It's ucl.ac.uk/STS/podcast. Well, that's it for today. We'll meet here again soon. Till then, everybody, happy April Fool's Day. I'm Professor Joe Cain. Thanks for listening. You've been listening to We Are STS, a podcast from the Department of Science and Technology Studies at University College London. Follow us online at ucl.ac.uk/STS/podcast.